this concept of background was the first study I've ever been aware of that they looked at background exposure in buildings, was by a gentleman called Byrom in the 1960s. Interestingly, the levels that they were measuring to, he says a limit of 0.04, and that's a very different figure that they were talking about. Okay, so really, if we're looking at asbestos in buildings, put the clearances to one side. If we're looking at asbestos in buildings and we're looking at background levels and looking at what we want to achieve, we should be looking at 3.05 fibres per mil. And there's lots of documents that refer to this figure. And this is why I think it's a slight misunderstanding of this figure. Seldom more than 3.05. Actual background levels were actually probably more like 3.02. It just says there's seldom more than 3.05, but people only ever talk about 3.05. In that paper by Doll and Pito, they say there's still a risk. So my Hodgson and Darnton paper said there was still a risk at 0.01. Doll and Pito in 85 said there's a risk of about 1 chance in 100,000 if you're exposed at background levels. So there's still, background levels are important and we want to try and drive to them, but there's still theoretical risk down at these levels. And I put this one up interestingly because we were doing this in the 1980s, and we were using electron microscopy in the 1980s to measure background levels in buildings because we wanted to understand what was going on. So we measured to background levels. The industry were going out doing 0.01, but the academics were doing to electron microscopy because they wanted to really understand what was going on. I've heard questions about asbestos surveys. In asbestos surveys, is it right to do algorithms that say, well, your sink pad is scored 14, but your lagging's 19? Is that a true representation of the situation? Should we be doing something better? Should we be doing air testing? Now, my view on background reassurance air testing is I think it's a very powerful tool, and I think it's a powerful tool to use much more sensitive air testing. Not in every situation, but when you want to understand something. This was Marks and Spencer's. They don't mind me mentioning it was them. And this was in their department stores, and they had plenum ceiling voids, AIB ceiling tiles with dust and debris above. They wanted to know what the levels were in their stores. In actual fact, in this, we only did PCM measurements, but we did them. We ran pumps for hours, and they weren't occluded. Everybody says, oh, you can't do that, it'll be occluded. They weren't. They were readable. I actually asked the analyst to fibre discriminate, and they were nervous about it, but they said, but what we're seeing is probably not asbestos. But we at least tried to get better in terms of not just looking at PCM, because I didn't care about 0.01. I wanted to give true reassurance and measure true background levels to understand that situation. There's a link there. This is a HSE report for Cwmcarn School in South Wales. I wasn't involved with this. And this kind of highlights the importance of testing in those circumstances, because basically what the top says there is 0.01 was totally inappropriate. The surveyors who went in and measured to 0.01 and also tried to quantify less than 0.01 with PCM, that was inappropriate. They used electron microscopy, transmission electron microscopy in this case, the health and safety laboratories, and they found next to nothing. So on the basis of the top, recommendations were being given that there was a problem with the school. HSL came in and said, no, actually, if you did it by electron microscopy, there isn't. So I'm not saying you go into every environment and do this test, but when you do the testing to reassure and do background testing, you need to do it properly. A couple of other circumstances briefly talking about, and again, I've talked about this in the roadshows, about this isn't so much air testing, this is testing from dust and swab samples. The circumstances in which we test, electron microscopy is a real powerful tool. Not in an environment like that, which is spotlessly clean. Let's not go and test for something that isn't there. It's relevant in the circumstance like that, where we know there's been an incident, we know there's contamination, and we want to understand that contamination better. I do a lot of expert witness work. I'm dealing with cases at the moment where we are doing electron microscopy to understand that contamination, because we know contamination has occurred. We just want to know how much and where it's occurred. In that circumstance, obvious debris, we don't need electron microscopy, we just need to take a bulk. So every situation is different and every method is different. It just has to be right in those circumstances.